Hi there. Welcome to Game of Our Own, a podcast about women who work in sports. I'm your host, Jahaan Blake. I bring you stories of women who are game changers, incredible leaders, and trailblazers in the sports industry. You will get a behind-the-scenes look of how they navigated their journey, valuable lessons they learned along the way, and advice for high-achieving women just like you. I'm excited you're here. Let's do this. There is no industry in this world that women can't get into and that our voices don't belong. That's what my next guest said during her interview. Susan Oguche, Communications Director for Nike Direct, shares gem after gem for women who work in sports or aspiring to work in sports. She talks about her journey of moving 4 times throughout her career for incredible opportunities. And if that's not hard enough, she gets candid about doing that with a family and gives advice on how you can do the same. The list of advice goes on. She talks about creating visibility in LinkedIn, how to articulate your value, how to show up for yourself, and with the awakening going on in our country right now, as it relates to Black Lives Matter, Susan shares how that's impacted her personally, professionally, and why our voices are so important to impacting change. I hope you enjoy. Susan, welcome to the Game of Her Own podcast. Thanks for joining.
Thanks for having me.
I'm so excited. So you have a very unique position and I can't wait to dive into it. But before we do, I have one question that I always like to ask people is, when did you fall in love with sports?
I think I've always loved sports. I grew up, obviously growing up Nigerian, soccer is a really big deal for us. And I remember, I think it was the World Cup that Nigeria went to, or maybe it was one of the other international games, but I just have this engraved in my brain, it's a goal! My dad running around the house. And, as growing up, I did more sort of, I guess, individual sports. I was focused on dance. So I did ballet, I did dance team. So I guess non-competitive, sports as I was growing up. And so personally, I wasn't in sort of the traditional team sports, but I loved watching sports, just seeing the excellence on the field or on the court and seeing people kind of push their bodies to the limits. And, gymnastics was also something I always really loved watching because it kind of brought in that strength and the boldness with the dance and the body movement. And so I feel like sports have always really been a big part of my life. And I've always kind of touched it a little bit throughout my career and in a way that's been really fun for me.
Okay, so let's go back to soccer real quick. There's so many things I want to say. So soccer was a big deal in your family, right?
Yes.
And your dad loved it, but you didn't play soccer growing up, huh?
I did not, because I was very hardcore into ballet. So I had ballet lessons 3 nights a week and competitions. And I have 3 brothers and they all played soccer when they were little. And I'm hoping to put my daughter in because it's such a fun sport. And it's a great way to kind of teach you how to be part of a team and stay active. But no, I only had so much time. My mom's I'm only driving you to one thing.
It's funny.
Just wisely.
It's funny. I was going to say, so I played soccer growing up. So immediately I'm like, wait, you didn't play soccer? But what's funny is you did, growing up, you were doing ballet. And that's exactly what I wanted to do. And I can remember vaguely being in class. And I don't know what happened. I'm sure if my mom's listening, she could be like, I could tell you exactly what happened. I probably quit or something. But it's the one thing I always think about. I'm like, God, I really wish I did ballet. I'd like to take it as an adult. Not that I'd be good, but.
You should. I just started taking it again. And I'm, the worst person in the class. So it's humbling, but it's still fun. So
I didn't know you could take it as an adult. I just figured they're I don't know. I probably just told myself you can't take it as an adult to protect myself and not embarrass myself.
I'll send you. There's actually a really good school in Chicago that's on the north side that I went to for a couple of years. So.
Okay, good to know. Tell everybody, I'm excited to dive into what you do because, the first few episodes have been my clients and they work for directly for a sports team and they work for an agency. So you have a unique role. So tell us a little bit about what you do and who you do it for.
Yeah. So in general, my professions, I'm in communications. So I I always call myself kind of like the chief talker and just trying to help brands of all sorts reach their audiences, mostly through media. And I've done it for a couple different companies, but I currently work at Nike. And my role is actually supporting our retail stores across the globe. So making sure that whether it's a new shoe that's dropping or it's a new initiative we have, how do we bring that to life for our customers that walk in through the Nike doors?
So Chief Talker, I love that title. Now, what's on your business card though? What's your actual title?
Yeah, so I'm the director of communications for Nike Direct. So Nike Direct is essentially everything that's directly talking to our consumers.
Got it.
So not going through like another retailer.
So you're supporting stores all across the country or the globe? What does that look
across
like?
the globe. Yeah. And so Nike has actually a really interesting mix of, different types of stores that serve different markets. So we have everything from, over the past couple of years, we've launched our Houses of Innovation, which are, I think the one in New York is like 60,000 square feet, like this huge sort of flagship store that's in New York right now. And there's one in Shanghai. And then we have really small stores called Our Lives that are, kind of in different markets around the globe. So there's obviously, other people kind of like me that sit in different countries and different regions around the world. And then I try to coordinate from a global standpoint.
Wow. That's a big job. So help us understand like what it looks like to support a store as a communications director.
So essentially, like I was saying in the beginning, is like trying to bring whatever the major campaign that we have. So for example, the Olympics is something that, is a huge undertaking for a brand that's so sports focused. Like sports is kind of the heart, soul, core of Nike. And so, that being such a major sport moment is so important to the company and important to the consumers that walk in through our stores. And so how do we make sure that if you're not in, whatever country that the Olympics are happening, that we're able to kind of bring in the spirit of that into the retail space, and then that we can sort of communicate what we're doing to support athletes, to support, we kind of say like athlete with an asterisk at Nike, because everybody who has a body is an athlete, whether you're a walker or you're, into ballet and trying to kind of get back into dance, or you're a casual runner or you play on a soccer league. And so, so not everybody's kind of at that pinnacle of sport at the Olympics, but how do you bring that spirit throughout the world and really support people as they're trying to take on, whatever their athletic pursuits are?
Lots of stores, lots of storytelling. That's what you...
Yes. Yeah, I think that's been one thing that's pretty consistent throughout my career. So I started at Procter & Gamble as like a baby PR person several years ago, and always, was able to have the kind of traditional brand PR and sports marketing as part of my job. And so supporting things like, the Summer and Winter Olympics, working with NFL teams, working with different sports leagues. That's been something that's been consistently part of my work. And it is about storytelling. It's about, how do you make sure that what you are putting out there, whether it's an ad or something, that it feels really true to the consumers that you're talking to on a daily basis. Okay. A lot of companies have sponsorships with sports teams because it's a great way to reach that audience of, sort of sports fans. But how do you make sure that it's really authentic, that it's true to what the brand stands for? And one of my favorite things that I worked on at P&G from a sports standpoint was working with Febreze. And we actually were in the locker rooms with a lot of sweaty stinkiness. But that was actually really fun to have a brand that actually made an impact within kind of that space. And then most recently, I worked at a company called Sleep Number. And we had a really cool partnership with the NFL where we were actually, helping to bring in sleep and sleep statistics as part of the overall, way that people were understanding the stats for an athlete. So, you see kind of what their weight is, what they're eating, their coaches are looking at all of those things, but how does sleep impact their performance? How does it, impact how they perform at practice? How does it impact how they're able to rest and recover? And so that was also really fun too. Because like I said, there's a lot of ways for brands to participate in sport, but I've had the most fun where I'm working with brands that actually have more than just their name attached to it, but are really finding ways to, whether it's freshen up the locker room or meaningfully improve the lives of athletes through sleep. And obviously, in my current life, like the company provides a lot of athletic gear and inspiration for athletes all over the world. So that's been really fun. And it's been a cool thread throughout my career.
So it sounds like you get to be really creative with the way you tell your stories. It's not about like the written word sometimes, right? It's about the different experiences people can have with your brand. Did I get that right?
Yeah, absolutely. And from a PR standpoint, like there's a couple different audiences. There's obviously the media, which is our first audience because they're the ones that help us tell our stories to their readers or to their viewers. But then there's also a lot of opportunities to connect directly with consumers or with normal people themselves. And both of those are fun. So the media piece can be experiential, but from a consumer piece, that almost always ends up being experiential. And so, different sports properties have a lot of cool like activations that they're doing now to let people, actually touch, feel, do, and participate with some of the brand sponsors. And that's been really fun too. But yeah, it's visual, it's written, it's also experiential.
You were at a Super Bowl, correct?
Oh, yes.
How many Super Bowls have you been to?
Well, what's funny? I've actually never been to the Super Bowl game, which is a travesty because as you know,
yep. Same here.
Working, but I have participated in 3 Super Bowls and it's been really fun and mostly through the fan experiences. And so that was like kind of my most recent one. I think it was not this year's, but last year's Super Bowl because I had already kind of moved companies, but being part of the fan zone was really fun and kind of to that point around being experiential. There's an opportunity where we can actually bring in our athletes to participate and, kind of interact with their fans. And then also another way to kind of dig deeper into what the brand means. Why are you sponsoring, a sports team?
That's exciting. Yeah, I'm right there with you. Super Bowls. I've done 5 and yes, they are overworking. Everyone's like, oh, how was the game? I was like, I've been there for 2 weeks. I was working. There was no such game. We weren't.
That's not what it was. But it was great when I watched it on TV, like the rest of the world.
I'm usually too tired to even watch it on TV after. I'm like, I'm done. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about your move. So now you're in Portland, correct?
Mm-hmm, yeah.
So you just moved from Chicago to Portland, but really Procter & Gamble, is that in Boston?
So I was in Boston with P&G, but P&G is actually headquartered in Cincinnati. So I started my career in Cincinnati and then was there for about 5 years and then moved over to Gillette in Boston.
Okay. And then from Boston, you came here to Chicago, right?
Yes. Yeah.
For work. And then you went to where you are now, Oregon. So you had all these different moves and were they all for your career?
Yeah.
Wow, talk to me about that. Like making those moves and moving from city to city. Like talk about what that was like.
I feel like in some ways I was predisposed to be like a Rolling Stone because growing up, my parents are academics and I always joke that, professors' kids are like army kids because until they get tenure, you're kind of not sure how long you'll be in place. And so I've lived in Louisiana, I lived in Alabama, we lived briefly in New Jersey, and then kind of settled in Ohio. And so that's always kind of been the kind of spirit of like, home is where your family is, home is where you make it. I think that is probably the first thing that kind of helped me with some of the moves. And then the second is just a work principle that I have, which is to just walk through the doors that open. I feel, very deeply committed to my faith. And I believe that like the right doors open at the right time. I've also seen the wrong doors close. And it took a while to like, you mourn some of those experiences as well. But I think, some of my moves have really been about that. So I had been, at Procter & Gamble for, at that point, I think so I had 4 summer internships. And then I had worked full time for about 8 years. And it was all I had ever known from a professional standpoint. And then there was the opportunity to go to Boston. And I was like, I've never been to Boston. Like I think I had traveled there once for my brother's graduation, but I was like, okay, I mean, sure. It was what was needed for the next step in my journey. Yeah. And it's just essentially been like that. So I was at P&G and somebody reached out to me from Abbott and had a really exciting role. It was work I had never done before. And a city that I'd always, coming from Ohio, I'd always kind of looked at from afar and been like, oh, that's what a real city looks like, coming from Cincinnati. So I always kind of looked at Chicago and thought it was a really fun city. And so jumped at the opportunity to kind of work there. And after I left Abbott, I had another role at a small startup in Chicago called Home Chef. And then ended up moving to a role in Minnesota with Sleep Number. But at that point, we were a little bit established in Chicago, and I wasn't necessarily ready to make the move to Minneapolis. Fortunately, my company let me kind of work remotely, traveling back and forth. But then when I got the call from Nike, I was like, okay, this feels like the right time to relocate. Mm-hmm. And it's been really awesome. It's a beautiful city, and working for such a great company has been such a blessing. But yeah, I can't even say I scripted it. I don't even think I would have been able to map it out like this. It wasn't intentional, but it was just trying to be open, trying to keep my network always kind of like, hey,
Yes. Yeah.
Trying to keep networking up and being just kind of open to stuff that I'd never done before, but evaluating it through, does this sound right for my family? Is this something I can learn? Does it feel like an opportunity for me to grow, and can I contribute? And so just trying to use that as my guiding principle, it's led me to a lot of really fun places.
That is incredible. Because when did you meet your husband?
So that's why I say it was a good thing to move to Boston, because I met him like right before I moved, and then he ended up moving with me to Boston. I actually met him at my going away party at a club in Cincinnati. So I'm always like, if I hadn't been going away, I wouldn't have had a going away party, and I wouldn't have met my husband. So.
I don't think I knew that. That's awesome. You were in Cincinnati. You weren't with your husband yet, and you're ready to make this move. And then obviously he's been by your side. And now you have a daughter by your side as well, making these moves. So, sometimes I hear from my clients, my coaching clients, that, well, I don't have time for a relationship. I don't want anyone to slow me down. They're not going to want to move with me from city to city. Like, I know what that feels like, right? Actually, I don't know what it feels like to move with a husband and child from city to city, because I was single, and then I, stayed put when I got married. So for people who are worried about having a family, but also following their career dreams, like what would you say to them? What advice would you give?
Yeah, I mean, I think that a lot depends on what you and your spouse agree on. And I think for me, from the beginning, working in the communication space, like even if you stay put, it's a role that you travel all the time. It has a lot of grueling hours. There's always some crisis around the corner that you're trying to mitigate. And so I feel really fortunate that my husband kind of understood that, and also had the flexibility and just kind of the openness to move. But it's not for everybody. I think that's where it is really tough. And I do, empathize with women who are trying to navigate that, men as well. But I think there's an assumption that, like, if you're the woman, you're always kind of like your husband's role is priority. I mean, I've heard from my friends across every profession, women who both them and their spouses are, professors, and they kind of are the trailing spouse. It's less common to have the husband be the one that's kind of following. Mm-hmm. But for me, I feel really fortunate that I have a husband that really understands and is super supportive. And I think that's the key. And you can't always predict that when you get married.
That was my next question.
But I think you can tell who's supportive of your career ambitions. And I think as much as people try and, make their lists of their perfect spouse, and they think like, oh, I want him to, have this faith, or I want him to look this way, or I want him to make this kind of money, or have these kind of principles. And I think if you're somebody who's career oriented, having a spouse that appreciates and values and respects what you're doing is something that's super important. Yeah. And it's something you should look out for as you're choosing your spouse. That sounds so like, I don't know, like grandma advice a little bit, but I think it's really important. And it's one of the things that people don't necessarily look at. It's like, if you have somebody who's expecting to have a very traditional household, especially in the sports world where games are at night and they're in different cities, and and if you have a partner who's expecting a little bit more of, like, I want dinner on the table at 6 and I want, this and that. and they want your career to put on the back burner, I think that's something to evaluate and to not let the conversation go without actually engaging in it and discussing it. And it's always compromise. I mean, there's other roles that I have been interested in that my husband's like, I don't want to. There was a role I was looking at that was in Florida, in Tampa. And he was like, I just don't think that that's where I want to go. And that's been tough because on the one side, it's like, yes, you're my biggest cheerleader. You got to support me. But on the other hand, it's like, you can't just carry your spouse around like a piece of luggage. Like, you guys have to sit, and it has to be right for both of you. It has to be right for your family. But I think the spirit of compromise, like, it can't always be one-sided. And that's one thing I feel like I'm really fortunate at, that my husband's been super supportive and totally gets it. And will also call me out on it when I'm like, he's like, hey, it's feeling a little one-sided now. Like, if you're, working like crazy every single night of the week, past hours, and you're leaving your spouse to be the one that's caring for the child all the time, that's not fair necessarily either. So I think it's negotiation. It's a lot of compromise and just trying to be really clear with what you need and the support you want.
Yeah, I think you nailed it. I don't think it sounds grandma at all. But what I hear you saying is that it really has to do with, having a supportive spouse, but really having that open communication and the spirit of compromise. Like, those sound like the biggest takeaways there when it comes to having a family. And from where I sit, and when I'm listening to you tell this story, I'm like, oh, she has it all. Like, you know what I mean? You have the family, you've moved from city to city, and like, it just, like, you're doing it. Like, you're out there with a great job and an impressive title, and you're doing impressive work. And you have a family, and you're raising a daughter. And so it sounds like you have the right values in place, right, to do that.
There's definitely days, especially now with this whole, COVID and everybody's at home, and there's days when I feel like I should be doing more, like with my kid. I should be like, I don't know, doing craft projects or whatever with her. But there's things that you sacrifice to try to keep everything in equilibrium. Like, I don't feel like I'm the type of worker I would be if I didn't have a husband or a daughter, or the type of spouse I would be if I didn't have work or a child. Like, everything loses a little bit, but I feel like I'm in a good place, and it hasn't always been super balanced, but I feel like I've been able to kind of reach that. And there might be times that it changes. I've had conversation with friends who, they've been going really great in their careers, and they have that third child, and they're like, man, I really think I need a break. Or they have that great career and they decide they want to go back and get their PhD or something. And so I think it's also like keeping yourself honest of, am I doing this because it's the path I'm on, or am I choosing every single day that this is the right thing for myself, the right thing for my family? Is what I'm losing out on worth what I'm gaining? And I had to go through that process even with my previous role. Like, I really enjoyed my job at Sleep Number. Like I said, we had a great NFL partnership and all of these things, but it got to the point where it was like, I'm literally away from my family 20 out of 30 days of the month. Like, is that what I'm willing? Like, I love my job. I'm well compensated. It's a great role, but I'm giving up a lot on the home front. And I had to reevaluate that. And how that equation works out, I think, shifts throughout our life. And I think where people start getting really, you wake up one day and you're just like, what am I doing? Who am I? And it's like, you daily have to analyze that for yourself and really keep yourself honest, and hopefully have a spouse that's like, has that equal balance of support and pushing you of like, is this still the choice that you want to make? So I'm just responding to like the have it all. Cause sometimes I feel like, wow, I'm like, I got everything done today that I wanted to do. And some days I'm like, oh my goodness, like my daughter's like scribbling on the wall and I was not paying attention to her. She decided to wash her hair and wash the bathtub because I was on a call at night. And I was like, I'm just going to put her like, I was like, had my computer. I was just sitting outside her like bathroom, and I look up and just like soap everywhere. So, I didn't feel like I had it all together that day, but I think we're all just trying to make it work and trying to balance it. But I think the important thing is like, your career is just as important as your spouse is. that your goals and your ambitions are just as important as, the other person's. And so trying to make sure that you leave space for that and you prioritize that, I think is really important.
Mm-hmm. And it's really good. And it's interesting when I say you have it all, and I've said that to some other women too. I'm like, oh, you got it all. Like you're doing all the things you want to do. And oh boy, it's never perfect, right? And just wait until your daughter tries to cut bangs for herself, because
oh my goodness,
I know we've all been there, right? Like we've all done it.
She tried to cut my hair the other day. She's like, I'm going to do your hair. And I'm like, what are those in your hair? So yeah, it's interesting.
It is. And it sounds like to me too, what I'm hearing a lot is like, when you say yes to something, whether work or family, it means you're saying no to something else. And so in order to balance that or just make sure you're staying on track, you have to have boundaries. And it also sounds like to me, your boundaries sometimes evolve as you grow, and whether it's your family or professionally or whatever. Did I get that right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the way that I kind of position it to people is like, you can't lose all of it, right? Like you can't have your family always be the one that's losing, or your work always be the one that's losing. Like you have to find a way to kind of spread the wins around, so that you feel that. And I think it's not just for yourself. It's like for the people who depend on you. I mean, whether you have a kid, even if you don't have a kid, or if you don't have a spouse, like you still have people who depend on you. You still have friends who care about you and want to see you. And, and those relationships and those other aspects of our lives are what make us whole. And so it's important to make sure that, that you're able to connect with all of those pieces.
Yes. I want to jump back into your fantastic job, right? So thinking about the journey you've had, like, all over the country. People can't see me. I'm making squiggly lines. But how did you feel prepared? I mean, you said something that I think a lot of women want to say is, I got the call from, right? So I got the call from Nike. That sounds so exciting. So when you did get the call from them, what prepared you along your journey for your role today?
I will give all the credit to an organization called Inroads, which is focused on essentially preparing minority youth for business and industry. My parents were both academics. I grew up on a college campus. My dad's a chemist. My mom's a computer programmer. And they had I told my mom I wanted to study marketing. She's like, I don't even understand what, do they make the ads? And I'm like, I think so. And, they just had this very different context. And my mom being, very plugged into resources and, never a program I wasn't part of, but she found out about Inroads, and it was an amazing internship experience. And organizations commit through Inroads to 4 summers of bringing high school or college students in. And so that was how I started at Procter & Gamble. And it was, I think for me, a really big game changer in setting me down the path of where I am today. So I think that's the first part of it is I feel fortunate that I was able to get that start, but not everybody gets that start, and not everybody knows exactly what they want to do when they're at that age. I just knew that I liked writing and I was really interested in marketing. And as I kind of went through my internships at P&G, I got deeper and deeper into the communications, public relations space. And I'm like, oh my goodness, this is writing and it's marketing and it's where I want to be. The other thing is just keeping a network of people. I know where there's been times in my career where I've wanted to jump to something else. And I've reached out randomly to people on LinkedIn. I'm obsessed with LinkedIn. If anybody is not hip to it, but I feel like I was an early adopter, because I'm like, wait, so I can connect to anybody in the world, and people want to put people are posting their whole career history on there, and I can reach out to somebody and ask them for guidance or just networking opportunities, or ask them to keep me in mind. So I feel like in some ways, networking has become my superpower, and continuing to build my network, obviously online, but then also, in real life, and staying in touch with those people, grabbing lunch with folks that you might have worked with before who may be in a different company, or and trying to build those relationships so that it's not only when you need something that you're reaching out to people. And then the second, I think, is like branding yourself. And that's where I think LinkedIn makes it so easy. I didn't know this, but a lot of the kids graduating now are like, especially in the comms and marketing space, they're actually creating like their own websites with like their portfolios and stuff. I was mentoring somebody who just graduated at Columbia, and she has like this beautiful online portfolio. And we didn't have those back in my day.
No, we did not.
Trying to hustle our way through it, but like it's such a smart idea. It's like how do you show up? And I think it's so easy now with social media to do, and I think to brand yourself. And it's one of the ways where I think a lot of us kind of in the space that are in the background a little bit. I consider myself more of a background person, in terms of like I have stage fright and I don't like to be the one that's up front all the time, and I write for the people who do it. Or you guys are, I know, especially in your kind of previous role, you're like orchestrating this beautiful interactions for consumer, for the fans to experience something. But we have to do the same thing for ourselves. So we have to kind of find ways to put ourselves out there. And so I think all of the times where people have like quote unquote reached out to me, it's because I've been visible on LinkedIn. And because my LinkedIn profile is like updated, and I think that's been part of it, because there are always recruiters that are using, those type of tools. And if they don't know kind of what your background is, if you don't have like links to things that you've done or things like that, and using that potentially as a portfolio, you might miss out on an opportunity.
Yes, I agree. So I'm glad you talked about your superpower. So I have lots of questions on that. I know a lot of clients are afraid when it comes to networking because they feel like they're going to be too pushy. They're shy, they're introverted, they feel like it's awkward, or they're inconveniencing people. What would you tell them if they were sitting in this room with you right now, this virtual room?
Yeah, I mean, I would say, what would you do if someone reached out to you? And most people would say, I would talk to them. I would be glad to share what I have learned and how I've kind of gotten to where I am. And I think that's most people. And so I get it. I mean, it's so scary, especially if you're reaching out to somebody you don't know. It's very frightening, and you don't know how they're going to respond. But what I found is that most people are giving away advice for free. They want, I mean, besides the time constraints, like people are really generous with what they know and what they've learned, and are usually willing to reach out to people. I think the times where it's been difficult for me, maybe on being on the receiving end, is if somebody's coming in there like, I need a job, can you give me an internship? And it's like, that's not always the right way. That's not networking. Networking is like, hey, I'd love to learn. I'm interested in this field, or I'm interested in this company. Like, can I learn from you? Those are the sort of invitations to networking that I've found the most kind of helpful and productive, is when someone really is trying to learn. And networking is the long game. It's not a job interview. It's about developing a relationship. I mean, in some ways, the name networking is kind of gross. Like, people hate it because it's like, oh, you're building your network.
Yes, I totally agree.
It sounds super artificial, but the idea is that you're just learning from people, that you're expanding who you know. And on the flip side, you're sharing what you know. And so I think when people approach it in that sense, and that like it's really about like reaching out to people, saying hi, and it might not turn into anything right now, but it might turn into something later, and being okay with that. I think that's the most important thing. Even, I mean, both of the roles that I got through recruiters that reached out kind of on LinkedIn, but they were connected to me through other people, and they kind of reached out and were like, I don't really have anything right now, but something might be coming open in the next whatever, like, would you be open for a call? And I think on the flip side, like if there are companies, or if there's organizations or sports leagues that are on people's lists, reaching out and say, hey, I am looking to kind of connect with other people that are in this field, and I'd love to meet with you for 15 or 20 minutes. Like that, everybody has 15 minutes to give away, and like making it seem from that person that it's not like hey, I want to get a job, but like, I just want to learn from you. I think those are the things that stick in people's minds. And so when something does open up that one, you already have that connection, whether it's through LinkedIn or through, personally. And two, hopefully you left that person with a really good impression and they'll consider you. So that's what, I mean, I think people think networking is kind of gross because they are making it gross. Like they might be approaching it with like the wrong expectations and the wrong kind of motives. But I think that almost every person that you reach out to is willing to share what they know and willing to have a conversation for 15 or 20 minutes. And I think that should make you less scared. Just think, how would you respond? That's probably the normal response that you'll expect.
I love that. And one more thing on LinkedIn, you said that you stay active on LinkedIn. What does that look like to you? Like, what does that mean?
For me, it's really showing a point of view and in the area that I kind of live in, which is in communications, kind of in branding and marketing. And so, I mean, right now, everything I'm posting is about how companies are responding to kind of I would say like almost like the racial injustice that's happening and kind of the awakening that's happening around the world. So it's definitely skewed right now and kind of celebrating what companies that I know that are doing great work and celebrating them. But typically I'm always reading articles about branding, about brands that make mistakes, about brands that are doing things that are really exceptional. And I try to have like a little bit of a point of view on it. And sometimes people comment or like it. Sometimes nobody does. But for me, it's just constantly keeping my voice out there so that the people who I do have in my network are seeing that, that are able to kind of look at me as an expert. They know that I'm up on the trends and what's going on in my industry. And it's just kind of like keeping yourself in front of them. Like there's a quote that I love that says that people remember what you say first, last, and most. And so the repetition of like, hopefully seeing me in their feed, seeing that I'm posting things that have to do with this field that show that I know what I'm talking about. I think that's one way to kind of stay active.
You are giving such gems. Like, this is really good stuff. I'm like, oh, this is really good too. And you're validating a lot of things I say, which is great. So people who are listening and have heard me say these things before, I did not pay Susan to say these things. Just so you're aware. I want to go back to your job because I'm clearly obsessed with your job. A lot of times women are asking me, how do I advocate for myself? Let me scratch that. Not even the advocate, but it's how do I show my value every single day, right? Like, how do I come to work and show up and show my value? It's how do I do it without bragging, right? How do I do it without feeling so, here comes that word again, pushy? So just love your thoughts on that.
I think that we should always be showcasing how we're adding value, whether it's just think about how a brand does something, right? Like, and if you think about yourself as a brand, like companies don't go and donate however many billions of dollars, millions of dollars and not tell anyone, right? Like they get the PR team together, they write a press release, they get the quotes, they distribute it, they follow up with media, they get it placed so that more people can know about it. And you should think about your career in that way. Like, obviously we all are trying to do the work and like make sure we're contributing. But if a tree falls in a forest, no one's there. If you're doing great work and nobody but your boss knows about it, and maybe your boss is not necessarily out there advocating for you, what are ways that you can advocate for yourself? So I think there's kind of two main ways. I think one is getting a mentor and building that network within your company of people who know your work and can vouch for you. It shouldn't always be just your direct manager. They should not be the only one that kind of understands the full scope of what you're doing. So trying to get those people that can advocate for you, that can sponsor you, that are going to be in those rooms that you're not in, and making sure they understand like, hey, I'm working on this really cool project. Here's what the results of it are. For me, when I was at P&G, especially as like starting out my career, that was like one of the best pieces of advice I got. And I literally had 3 people that I met with that were kind of the director and above level. I met with them monthly. And I would just say like, hey, this is what I'm working on. Because I knew that they were in those rooms talking about who's getting promoted, who's getting ratings, and making sure that you have an advocate in that space is really important. And then I think on the other piece of it is just like you speaking up for yourself. And it doesn't have to be a big presentation of all your work all the time. Obviously, we all have like annual, performance reviews and things like that. That's an obvious time that you should be showcasing your work. But I always do even just like quick recaps of programs that I'm working on. So if I'm doing a launch of something, like I'll just pull together at the end of it, like a quick recap and just send it out to my team. And one, it's for me to document what I've done. And I mean, it's literally usually like, here's what we did, here are the results, here are some things we learned, send. And it's gotten kind of so like people kind of expect it now, but it's a non-braggy way. You're not saying like, hey, look at me. Like you position it as, here are insights that I learned. Here's holding myself accountable to the results. And here are some things that, you guys can maybe keep for future reference. And so that's something that it's different from like, oh, I did a really great job on that presentation. Everyone should give me credit. It feels a little bit more like professional, I think, and lets you keep a record. So when you have those end of year conversations, you can pull that together really easily. I'm actually preparing for mine right now. I haven't been here for a year, but for my evaluation. And I always pull together just like a one pager that's like, here are my results, essentially like your resume, but for what you've done in the past year. And I am working on that now for my boss, but I've done it throughout my career, just as a way to remind my direct boss of what I've done, because they will forget. A year is a really long time to remember every single thing that you've done. And you should know that. And it's a great way to remind them of that as they're pulling together their evaluations. So yeah, I think those are two ways. And then I sometimes position my successes as like examples. So for example, like if we're talking about like, a social campaign, I will throw out an example that, when I was working on this social campaign at XYZ company or with XYZ brand, here's what we did. Here are the results we got. It was really great. I can share some learnings about that if you're interested. And so it's kind of braggy, but like not totally braggy, and also in the service of what you're doing, because that's the other thing is that I think, all of us have such great experience, and wherever you were brought there because you know what you're talking about, you know what you're doing, and how do you apply that experience to your current job? And I think part of that is like overtly stating that. It's a great way to show, to add value. It's a great way to remind people of what you're doing. And it continues to position you as kind of the expert because you have that experience under your belt.
Mm-hmm. These are smart strategies. Really smart. So let me ask you a question. I think I know the answer, but when you're doing these, has anyone said to you, Susan, you know what? You seem a little full of yourself, or you seem a little braggy? Has anyone ever even said that?
Never.
In your career? Yeah, I didn't. No, I didn't think so.
And it's interesting because I've experienced people who are braggy, and even those people, nobody says, "Oh, you're braggy." I think women just have this fear of sometimes being spotlighted, and I think we have this kind of team mentality. This was actually something somebody told me really early on, because I would position everything as like my team, and my boss was like, "But you don't have a team. Like you did that." I'd be like, my team, did XYZ thing. And he's like, you can say I worked on this thing. It's hard to unlearn that, because I think as women, we're kind of supposed to be like very team oriented, extremely collaborative, not always spotlighting ourselves. And I think it's something that we can stand to do more of. I think there's rarely a woman that I've encountered that is overly braggy. I think that we're usually the opposite. I think we're usually overly apologetic. I think we couch everything in terms of I think and I feel. I think we give other people a lot more credit than we give ourselves. I think this is a huge opportunity for a lot of people, even myself. I am not perfect at it either, but I think the fear of being too braggy is something that our male colleagues do not really experience, and is rarely something that comes up on people's like feedback.
Nope, not at all. And if it does, then it usually has a lot to do with the manager, not the actual employee.
Yeah, absolutely.
That has been my experience. Ooh, let me ask you this big question. Okay, with everything that's going on in the world, like, I want to be able to talk about it with you. We don't have to spend the rest of our time on this. I know we also have to get back to work, but thinking about what's going on in America and how everyone's just really awakening to all of the, systemic racism that's going on. Right?
Yeah.
A lot of times, and I've always asked this question, but not at this time in, our lives, but what advice would you give women, women of color especially, who feel like they're at a disadvantage because nobody looks like them in the room? No one looks like them within their organization.
I mean, this is a really tough time, I think, to be Black in America. And it's interesting because all this stuff has been going on for the past couple of weeks. And there's nothing that's like actually changed from a month ago when nobody was talking about it and we all pretended like we were in a post-racial society.
Yes.
But I think the fact that it's like constantly being talked about, I think is hard because people who have experienced violence or experienced discrimination, it's in some ways kind of re-traumatizing. And so that's been really tough. And then you have people trying to engage in conversations with you that you may or may not feel comfortable having. So I would say the first thing is make sure that you have people that you can be candid with. And it might not be in your workplace, or it might not be, it might be your friend group or something, but have someone that you can that can help kind of take care of you in this situation, that really cares for you and that you can talk to about how you're feeling and how you're experiencing this moment. I feel really fortunate that my company has been doing a lot of just kind of like open town hall style talk sessions where people can just share like how they're experiencing this time. And that's been really awesome. But even if you don't have that, even if it's just like a group of your girlfriends or your parent or your spouse, that you can just like verbalize how you're feeling, I think that's really important. And I think the second thing is just having a lot of courage during this time. It's hard, but even if you're the only Black person there, there is one, and your perspective, your point of view would not exist if you weren't there. And so, in some ways it's easier to kind of like, go along to get along. But I think what I'm seeing right now is people speaking with boldness and calling their companies out and holding their bosses accountable, even through trembling voices, and really being willing to speak their truth. Because if there's any time that anybody's willing to hear, it's now. And I've been, even at my company that's, I think, leading in a lot of ways in this space, I have a lot of meetings that I sit at and I'm the only Black person. And it's been difficult, but it's also, I've seen people be moved by me sharing with vulnerability. So that's kind of the third thing I say, like, find a way to take care of yourself and find someone you can express this feeling to. Be willing to speak with boldness to the folks that are kind of around and would not hear your point of view if you weren't there. And I think the third thing, and maybe it would be the first, but is just to be vulnerable, because I think stories really move people. I think that a lot of the stuff that's being brought up right now, none of it's new. It's not just about one person. It's not about George Floyd. It's not about Breonna Taylor. Like it's stuff that's been going on for so long, and now it's finally kind of getting recognized. And I think there's something really powerful about us sharing our stories and saying, hey, this is not just some person that you claim was a criminal or you thought maybe should have acted differently in his interaction with police or in her interaction with police. This happened to me, or here's how I experienced discrimination. Or even just saying, like, being the only Black person in this office is really hard for me because I don't feel understood in XYZ way. And that's something that I've seen across a lot of my friends that work in different companies, like even companies that aren't really attuned to this or think this has nothing to do with them, saying, in fact, I do deal with racism in this company, or I do feel like we need to address our diversity and inclusion issues because we should not have only one Black person in a company that represents, a diverse country, and sharing that from a very personal point of view, I've seen that really, impact people. So it's hard because I feel like I spent all of last week like crying in almost every meeting and just saying, talking about my brother's experience with police brutality and times where I felt marginalized and times where I knew I was being discriminated against because of race. And it's been difficult, but I think it's such a lived experience for most people of color, and it's such a foreign experience to white people in this country that we have to let that out. It's not a dirty secret for us to keep anymore. We keep it all inside so that other people are comfortable. But I heard someone say the other day, like, it's time for us all to get uncomfortable. It's not just for minorities to be uncomfortable and have to kind of swallow their pride and swallow their pain. It's for all of us to really, confront what's going on and lean into the moment with action. And I think a big part of that is, if you are that only person in the room, to be willing to share.
Mm-hmm. I like that. So you have 3 pretty, I think, powerful strategies, if you want to call them that, for people to kind of grab onto if they need them. So I think one is find someone you could be candid with, right? So don't internalize it, right? I spent a lot of my career internalizing some of this stuff because with it comes shame and you just don't want to talk about it, right? Yeah. Let me tell you, don't do that, because it all came out last week and it wasn't pretty, so it comes back. It's not going to go anywhere. So I love that one, finding someone you could be candid with. And that's what I have found this week as I've come up for air. And then I hear you saying, use your voice. Now is the time. And you're right. People are willing to listen, and they're listening differently than they did before.
Yeah.
Right. And so if you're not finding that, then you might want to reevaluate where you are, right? Where you're working. But I'm finding that people are listening, but they're listening differently. And they want to learn, and then they want to figure out how they can take action. So now is the time to speak up. I know that for me, I said, I am no longer being silent.
Mm-hmm.
I will no longer be silent. I will tell my stories of the past, but if it happens again, I will speak up in the moment. And I think that's really good advice. And then the vulnerability. So it's okay if you cry at a meeting.
Yeah.
It is okay. This is emotional stuff.
Yeah.
Be willing to talk about it, because so much good is going to happen. Your perspective, like you said, is so important.
I always thought, like, everybody sees this, right? Like, everyone saw her make fun of me because I was XY, a Black woman. I'm Nigerian, make that really racist joke. Everybody saw that, right? And they don't see it. They don't see it the way that you're experiencing it. They don't see it in the context of the history of this country. They don't see it in the context of what's going on outside of the building. And it might not always be out of malice. It's just because there's just such a different experience. If you're not looking for it, you're not going to see it, if you're not attuned to it and aware of it. And so that's where I was able to say, like, man, like, through streaming tears, where I was able to kind of share. And I think, to your point, like, it doesn't ever go away. You just try to shove it down and it comes back up. And on top of that, like, racism is destructive to all people. It's not just about Black people who are experiencing it. Like, a company that does not have diverse voices is missing out on diverse perspectives, diverse ways of thought. It's missing out on the richness that comes when different people come together. It's missing out on what it means to be American. And so it's all of our responsibility to kind of create that wherever it is that we are. And so as much responsibility as I think we put on ourselves to sort of hide this shame of the discrimination we've experienced, it's also on, people who are in positions of power, people who are white, to learn and to hear, and they can't advocate if they don't understand. My mom used to tell me all the time when I'd come from school and I'd kind of be moody, and she's like, what happened? And I'm like, I don't want to talk about it. And she's like, well, I can't help you if you don't tell me. I can't go and talk to the principal about, bullying that's going on or whatever, or within the corporate context, I can't go and try and advocate for, more interns of color, or for inclusivity in holidays. Let's stop calling it Christmas. Let's call it the holidays, because people are Jewish and they're, they celebrate different holidays during that time. I can't advocate for you if I don't know, because I don't live that experience. And so I think the part of the vulnerability is like having faith that our stories can actually change people's hearts and change kind of how companies function. And we're seeing it now, like, in real time, obviously, sadly, because of a tragedy, but I think it's given a lot of people the boldness to come out and actually share their stories. And some of them are heartbreaking, and some of them are not people you thought you would ever hear those stories from. My brother works at Goldman, and he just wrote an essay last week about his experiences. I mean, he went to MIT. He has this great job at this company, and he's experienced police brutality. And you'd be like, no, like not this nerdy boyfriend. I mean, he's my brother, so of course I'm going to call him a nerd. But he doesn't look like the type of person that would be resisting arrest and be thrown on the ground by a cop. But it happened to him, and not everybody's situation is exactly that, that severe, but like we've all experienced it, and it's unbelievable to the people who hear it sometimes, but that's what makes it so incredibly important for us to share, to normalize it so that we can address it.
This is really, I think, really good stuff. I think it'll be empowering for women to hear this conversation that we just had. I think if we opened with this, we probably would have spent the whole entire time
probably
talking about this. So it might be a to be continued. I don't know, but this was fantastic. So I want to say, I hate to end here because I wanted to keep talking, but thank you so much for being a guest. This was fantastic.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for having me on and for all that you're doing to empower women. I mean, it's so important that we show up there is no industry in this world that women cannot get into and that our voices don't belong. So what you're doing to empower people and give them the courage to take on what is next for them is so important. So thank you.
Thank you. What did you think of Susan's advice? Can you implement some of the strategies she shared? I'm going to ask you a favor. Is there someone you think would benefit from hearing Susan's interview or any of the interviews on this podcast? Would you share it with them? My goal is to empower women in sports, and I hope that these interviews help. Thank you for listening. I would love to stay connected with you. You can follow me on Instagram @JahaanBlake, and don't forget to subscribe to this podcast. If you're interested in learning more about how I can support you in your journey in the sports industry, email me at jblake@thejblakegroup.com or send me a DM on Instagram. I look forward to hearing from you.